Hey, welcome to Modern Day Debate. Very excited to have you here as today we are debating whether or not the Gospels are reliable, and we're starting right now. So, glad to have you here, everybody. We have got two excellent guests. Why are they excellent? I'll give you two reasons. One, both well read, both have studied a lot, like big time. So, that's something I'm very excited about, is that these guys have put in a lot of years, as you'll see in a second. And for that, we're just thankful to have them here, that they're going to share. You could say that we're doing this vicarious learning where we get to kind of reap the fruits of their years of reading. So that's what my kind of the goal of this channel was. And second of all, these guys are so cordial. In the emails, if you saw the emails, you would think that like Jonathan and Jim were like best friends in terms of how good they are to each other. So I'm just thrilled to get to have these guys on tonight. They're both gentlemen and they're both very well read. So if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We've got debates every week, and hopefully we'll even get to have these guys come back in the future. I'm very confident tonight's going to go very well. So with that, we're now just going to cover a couple of things. Something new that we're very excited about. So basically, we want to talk about the debater's history, you could say. So with that, I'm just going to explain that the debaters have been doing this for a long time. And let's see where I got it here. Sorry about this. I'm a little bit...
James is really excited about this.
Yeah, you can tell. I definitely am. So I've got, well, what I'm going to do is introductions while I set that part up because I'm just getting it ready. Now, both of the debaters' links are in the description. We highly encourage you to check out their links. And hey, even if you don't agree with them, you can at least hear from their point of view what their arguments are. So straight from the horse's mouth, it's not kind of pre-digested by somebody on your own side. That's kind of the advanced apologist or atheist, whatever you want to call yourself, as you go and you study the other side on your own. So with that, Jonathan, very excited to have you here. If you want to share what's going on at your channel, we'd love to hear it. Thanks for coming.
Okay, no, thank you. I'm Jonathan Sheffield. Over the last 2 years, or 2.5 years, I've actually dedicated my channel to understanding how we got the text of the New Testament. I've taken on a lot of issues regarding textual criticism, different readings that are found in our text, and I've put it to animation style this way to help bring down the technicality of this subject in a way that can be understood. So I know I just recently finished up with my debate with Dr. Richard Carrier on the last 12 verses of Mark, whether it's authentic or interpolated, and I'll be coming out with some of the videos animation style for my debate over the next few months.
Excellent. Well, we're honored to have you here, Jonathan, so thanks for coming by. And Jim, glad to have you here. First time here. Thank you very much for just how easy you've been to work with, just so kind, and I appreciate that. And if you want to share what's going on at your channel, Jim, we would love to, or I should say organization as well. The links, again, everybody, are down in the description, so highly encourage you. You can check out both of the speakers' links. Go ahead, Jim. Thanks for coming.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jonathan. If you go to our YouTube channel, it's the username is Atheist Republic. Just search for us. We'll come right up. We do weekly news where we cover religious events from around the world. We do that Saturdays. We also do discussions with people about important systemic issues within society that also have something to do with religion or atheism. And we also have, you can also go to atheistrepublic.com, where you can find a lot of great resources and links about who we are, what we represent, and we are also promoting our first national, Atheist Day, which is going to be March 23rd of this coming year for atheists and atheist allies alike to help encourage those who are still in the closet that it's okay to come out, that it's not so scary on the outside.
Yeah, and I like the idea of saying, hey, like, let's embrace atheists. Like, whether
Sure.
you're Christian, Muslim, atheist, we're glad you're here at this channel. It's an honor to have you. And so, Jim, thanks for sharing that. Excited to have you here, buddy.
Thank you so much, man.
Yeah. So with that, let's transition to the tail of the tape. This is what I was excited about, everybody. So you can see here Sheffield and Majors. This sounds like a boxing match. Like that actually does. Sheffield versus Majors. It is basically just a summary of the debaters' points of view. So there you have their views, Christian and atheist, and then you have their ages, and then the really the most important part, of course, more than age, obviously, is that the years of relevant study is really where it's at, as well as number of past debates. So they're pretty darn evenly matched. These guys love to hit the books, and so that's why we are very happy to have them here. So with that, we will get started. So just to let everybody know, the basically how we're going to do this is we have introductions that are going to be about 12 minutes. And so those introductions, pretty like simple, I think, is that the main thing just to remember is that it's 12 minutes introduction, then we're going to 2 rebuttals, and then cross-exam finally, which I know that you guys are excited about. That's actually my favorite part as well. So that'll be a blast. So with that, we will now start moving forward. And so I just want to say, lastly, as mentioned, the debaters' links are in the description. Highly encourage you to check them out. So here we go with our, oopsie. Oh, there we, that's different. Oh, that's all right. Don't worry, I've got it. So with that, setting the clock. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Starting the clock. And don't worry, I've got it. Here we go. Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan's going to go first, taking the affirmative. Thanks, everybody, for your patience with that. I'm nervous. I'm excited. But, Jonathan, I'm going to start on your first word. So on your first word, we will start the clock for your introduction. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on Modern Day Debate, and thank you for Jim joining us as well to share his perspective on this issue. Now, I want to open up by explaining that there are 2 major theories that have been popularized in such titles as Misquoting Jesus by Dr. Bart Ehrman, and also the text of the New Testament by Dr. Bruce Metzger concerning the text of the New Testament Gospels, which assert that the biblical scriptures commonly received by the apostolic churches are corrupt. Now, the first theory propagated by Dr. Ehrman is that the New Testament Gospel publications of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by the disciples of Jesus. For Dr. Ehrman has stated, we don't know who wrote them. All we know is that they certainly weren't the followers of Jesus who spoke Aramaic and were lower class peasants without an education. These books are written by highly educated Greeks, probably living outside of Palestine 40 or 50 years later. The problem with Dr. Ehrman's narrative is it doesn't explain how the independent Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean basically come up with the same 4 books, naming the 4 authors, unless it does go back to the apostles, as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the apostolic churches said it did. Dr. Ehrman couldn't even identify by name who these well-educated Greeks were or where they are from. He also doesn't explain why well-educated Greeks would write in Koine with smatterings of Aramaic instead of Attic or Alexandrian. Or how does this school of thought explain that the overwhelming majority of apostolic churches independently testify to these same 4 books, naming the same 4 authors, while the texts of the Gnostics all differed amongst themselves? In any other court of law, this testimony would be conclusive. But the theories don't stop there. Both Dr. Ehrman and Metzger have also asserted that the New Testament scriptures that have come down to us today are not the same New Testament scriptures that were originally received by the official apostolic churches. And to be clear, the changes that Dr. Ehrman and Metzger are speaking of are not spelling errors, copyist slips, word line omissions, or variants, but these scholars are referring to an evolutionary process of the New Testament text, where readings such as the last 12 verses of Mark, the woman accused of adultery in John, and hundreds of other readings were conflated into the text over an unknown period of time. Now, these theories naturally beg the following questions. Who were the scribes? Where were they from? And how were they able to make these massive changes to scriptures throughout the ancient world without anyone ever noticing? And then get the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches to agree and come up with these same consistent readings that is witnessed in the Latin Vulgate, Peshitta, and the texts of the Greek Orthodox churches. So, how did such a major change to the text of the New Testament infiltrate thousands of texts in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic apostolic churches in the ancient world? Well, here lies the problem with the school of thought, which is the basis for these interpolation theories of the last 12 verses of Mark, the pericope adulterae, and other traditional readings. Since the creation of these theories in the late 18th century, that began with scholars such as Griesbach and then with Hort in 1881, this scholarship has been unable to historically substantiate these theories that ever happened. For this is what J.N. Birdsall is saying in referring to his own work, Hort's premise, the work of Late, Lagrange, Cowell, and Streeter, when he declares, it is evident that all presuppositions concerning the Byzantine text, or text except its inferiority to other types, must be doubted and investigated de novo. Who maintains their conclusions when the hypothesis continues to fail? Kurt and Barbara Allen seem to agree with Birdsall when they state in around 1995 that no adequate history has yet been written of the Byzantine text. But this is a task we may leave to a future generation. In other words, all this school of thought has provided is postmodern narratives to explain the creation of all these commonly received readings, like the last 12 verses of Mark and the woman in adultery. Key point here. Now, surely if the provenance of our Gospels is unknown, and the text contained in our document shows signs of collusion, then obviously this would weigh heavily against the reliability of our documents, thus nullifying the testimony in. But in order to understand the formation of our New Testament Gospels, we must first investigate the documentation from the ancient world, from Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Eusebius, who explains how it was done, as opposed to the speculation of the German rationalism of the late 18th and 19th century that includes such scholars as Goblet Christian Storr, Christian Herman Wise, Griesbach, and Anthony Fenton Hort. Now, in regards to the formation of texts in the ancient world, Dr. Richard Carrier actually tells us in his published work, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, that the Aeneid was written in a period of history that is exceptionally well documented, which allows us to understand in good detail the context of the Aeneid's formation. For we know the author of the Aeneid, which is Virgil, and we have documentation who Virgil was, which was a poet at the time of Caesar Augustus. Now, given that both the formation of the New Testament and the Aeneid occurred around the 1st century under the control of the Roman Empire, a period of history that Dr. Carey himself asserts is exceptionally well documented, it would follow that we could also document and understand the historical formation of the New Testament, as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Gaius of Rome during the 2nd century were able to actually name some of the authors and provide details for the formation of the so-called Gnostic text that we see in the editions of Marcion, the Gospel of Truth by the Valentinians, and in the text created by Basilides. So when we come to the writings of Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, who was a bishop appointed to the episcopate of Gaul, who lived in Asia Minor and learned at the feet of Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, who Tertullian affirms was appointed by John the Apostle over the churches of Asia Minor. Irenaeus, who's actually responding to the textual claims of the Gnostics, provides the following testimony. First, Irenaeus documents that the gospel testimony was not only preached abroad, but also handed down to the apostolic churches in written publications. Now, Irenaeus also identifies who authored the gospels, the order of the publication, where they were published, and the source of their information when he affirms Matthew among the Hebrews issued a writing of the gospel in their own tongue, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel at Rome and founding the church. After their exodus, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us a writing of what Peter had preached. Then Luke, the follower of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel as it was preached by him. Finally, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also lain on his breast, himself published the gospel while he was residing at Ephesus, Asia. Now, Irenaeus also states that the textual traditions of the apostles, that is made clear in all the world, can be clearly seen in every church by those who wish to behold the truth. In other words, this testimony can be empirically verified by examining the official writings of the apostolic churches. Now, Tertullian, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire in Carthage, Africa, writing around 190 AD, against the textual claims of Marcion, corroborates Irenaeus' testimony, and he states the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, while that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, who interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel, men usually ascribe to Paul. Now, the next point is key because it addresses how the apostolic churches are able to source their texts and readings back to the apostle.
2-minute warning.
Irenaeus, in the same book and chapter, documents that we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in the churches and their successors down to our time, and also confirms we appeal again to that tradition which has come down from the apostles and is guarded by the succession of elders in the church. This system, which describes the apostolic policy, establishes a transfer, control, and mechanism for the writings back of the apostles. In other words, the legal chain of custody for that text. Now, Tertullian uses this policy in defending the text of the apostolic churches against Marcion and gives a very clear example. So when Marcion rejected John's Apocalypse, Tertullian responded by saying, we have St. John's fossil churches, and the order of bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will yet rest on John as their author. In other words, we can establish a legal chain of custody for the text and its readings of the Gospels back to the apostles. So if we reject how the apostolic churches said it was done, and by who, as evinced in the writings of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Eusebius, then what documentation or tome from the ancient world do we have that explains an alternative way to how it was done by who?
30 seconds.
Consequently, if it wasn't the apostles, then who wrote the text? When did they create the text? Where is the epicenter? And how did they get almost all the apostolic churches to go along with these four gospels? When many of the Aramaic churches didn't even accept Revelation, Jude, 2nd and 3rd John, 2nd Peter, and the pericope adultery. Narrow conclude my opening statements.
Excellent. With 2 seconds to spare, that's well timed. So, very articulate. We appreciate that very much, Jonathan. And so we are excited now. We will have an introductory statement from Jim Majors. So, Jim Majors, I'm going to start the clock on your first word. The floor is yours. Oh, I think that I'm not sure if other people I'm not quite hearing you.
Sorry,
Oh,
sorry,
there.
I had you muted. Sorry about that.
No problem. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Jonathan. First, I'd like to thank James for setting up this debate and allowing me to represent my side of the argument. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Sheffield for his willingness to answer this question that has long been debated. Are the Gospels reliable? All we have to consider are the texts themselves, along with a few contemporary external references, some which Mr. Sheffield alluded to. But what else do we have to analyze these texts besides each other? How else do we determine who wrote the Gospels? We know it wasn't an eyewitness. We can take just one event, one very important event, the crucifixion of Jesus. When Jesus was crucified, who recorded the trial before Pontius Pilate, the making of the sign that hung above Jesus' head, the mocking on the cross, the promise of salvation, whether it was to a thief in Luke or not, the last words of Jesus, and finally the death of the Son of God. In Matthew 27, verses 55 through 56, it tells us that the women were watching from a distance, and reading earlier in the Gospels, we see that all of the disciples had fled for fear of persecution, to the point to where Peter was repeatedly denying Jesus in order to save himself. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, these various witnesses, including Roman soldiers and people who were mocking Jesus, they were. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. Sorry, man. Okay, so how do we know if Jesus was the Son of God? There are very few things that we have to go on, and when analyzing and critically examining these Gospels, our interpretations are confined to existing presuppositions, whether Christian, Jew, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, or indifferent. And my whole life, I found the narratives of the life of Jesus to often be inspiring, sometimes melancholic, other times infuriating, but always questionable. Our personal convictions sometimes take priority in the discovery of the truth, no matter the knowledge you're pursuing. But when it comes to the reliability of the Gospels, it suddenly becomes more of a priority. After all, these are the alleged eyewitness accounts of the birth, life, death, and alleged resurrection of Jesus, the Son of God. While I admit I cannot approach this important question from an unbiased perspective, I can only analyze and accept verifiable and verifying information and offer up what knowledge I have to be analyzed and considered by Mr. Sheffield. The arguments that I'll be making tonight are not epiphanic ideas, nor are they original. There are many before me, and there will be many after me who have and who will come to the same conclusion that I have, that the Gospels are not reliable. Throughout the history of Christianity, we see the effects of biased presuppositions in the way the Gospels are written, interpreted, copied, and preached. So who wrote the Gospels, and how do we know it? According to Mark, Papias tells us that it was John Mark. He tells us that he gives us an account in his own words about God. About Jesus on authority of an elder who was traveling with Aristion that Papias names outside of the 11 apostles. Papias lived from 60 to 163 CE. He's the earliest known source that we have for the Gospels, especially for Mark and Matthew. He wrote a 5-volume commentary called The Sayings of Jesus. It has the earliest records. They were used by the early Christian church leaders from the 2nd to the 4th century. Prior to that, we have no knowledge of what happened. There are no surviving texts of Papias, save for those of Irenaeus from the late 2nd century and from Eusebius from the early 4th century, in which most of his writings are just copying what Irenaeus was saying. For instance, in Against Heresies, Irenaeus confirms his claim that there is an apostolic succession from the apostles to Papias. He says, and Papias, who was John's auditor and Polycarp's companion, a man of the earliest era, also attests these things in writing, the fourth of his books, for there are 5 books composed by him. Papias mentioned a John in his writing, but is this a John the Apostle? Irenaeus seemed to think so, but Eusebius disagreed. Eusebius says, Irenaeus also mentions these as his only writings, using the following words, and here he's quoting Irenaeus, saying, and these things Papias, who has been a hearer of John and a colleague of Polycarp and an early man, corroborated in writing in his 4th of books, 5 books that he composed. So wrote Irenaeus. Yet Papias himself, according to the preface of his volumes, in no way presents himself as a listener and eyewitness of the apostles, but teaches that he had received the articles of faith from those who had known them. He goes on to say that the interpretations with everything I have learned thoroughly and remembered thoroughly from the presbyters. So how reliable is this? Not very reliable. In fact, Eusebius goes on to blame Papias for sharing the early millennialist belief that Jesus would have a 1,000-year reign on earth before the end of the world, and I'm probably misrepresenting that because it's not my belief. I just think it's ridiculous. But so he says, I suppose he got these ideas through a misunderstanding of the apostolic accounts, not perceiving that the things said by them were spoken mystically in figures. For he appears to have been of very limited understanding, as one can see from his discourses. But it was due to him that so many of the church fathers after him adopted a like opinion, urging in their own support the antiquity of the man, as for instance, Irenaeus and anyone else that may have proclaimed similar views. What views is he talking about? He says that there will be a period of some 1,000 years after the resurrection of the dead, and that the kingdom of Christ will be set up in a material form on this very earth. And he doesn't have anything good to say about him regardless. Now, what about internal evidence, textual evidence? Well, P52 is the oldest manuscript of the Old Testament that dates to 125 CE, the original of it that it was copied from, probably being written somewhere in the late first century, about 96 CE. It contains a few verses from John 18 on both sides of a piece of papyrus no bigger than a credit card. And even our earliest manuscript, P52, is almost 30 years removed from the alleged autograph. 30 years from the original work. And that original work is an additional 60 years removed from the time of the event, from the time the author wrote. So how many copies are between P52 and the eyewitness accounts of John? Nobody knows. Is there an original? Nobody knows what it is. So how can we speculate what the original is? We can only look at the evidence that we have within the manuscripts themselves. We can only compare the manuscripts and the sources and see where they come from. For instance, the pericope of the adulteress, where Jesus is approached by the Pharisees with a woman who has been committed of adultery or committed of sinly acts, and basically traps Jesus and says, what would you have us do with them? And if he says with the week that Jesus should stone her, then he is immediately rejecting everything that he's about, everything that his movement's about. But if he doesn't stone her, then he is directly rejecting Mosaic law. He's directly rejecting the Old Testament. So he has to ponder this. So he squats down, writes in the dust. He stands back up, ponders some more, squats back down, writes in the dust, and he tells the Pharisees, he said, "Let he who is among you without sin cast the first stone." And one by one, as Jesus is writing in the dust, these Pharisees leave. Finally, there is no one. Jesus asked the woman, said, "Is there no one here left to condemn you?" And she said, "No, my Lord." He said, "Well, neither then do I condemn you." And said, "Go and sin no more." This is not existing in our earliest manuscripts, not even by a long shot. There's no hint of evidence in P66. P66 is the oldest existing manuscript that contains that part of John, and it does not have it, along with many of our other ones. But is P66 something that is reliable? Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the textual variants in P66 are extremely low. But we don't see any sign of it within the first 400 years. And where it does exist, it varies. Is it in Luke? Is it in John? Is it in the Gospel of Hebrews, which is where Papias refers to it to, is in the Gospel of Hebrews, has nothing to do with John. And by the 4th century, there were only three versions of the adulterous story. One was from the Gospel according to the Hebrews, according to Didymus the Blind. One, according to Papias, which is probably pretty close to the same thing. And then another one that we find in the Gospel of John, which kind of combines those two stories. For instance, we have interpolations in some of our oldest manuscripts that aren't just that. For instance, Matthew 27:49 in the Codex Sinaiticus, where it says that the other took a spear and pierced his side, and immediately came out water and blood. That reading isn't in there originally. It is in some of the other Alexandrian. It's in some of the other Alexandrian texts, but it's not. It's not original. There are so many more that I'm sure that we'll go over. I guess with that, I'll end my time.
You bet. Thank you, Jim Majors. Very clear and articulate opening. So now we get into the even more exciting part where both debaters will be giving their responses to the other's opening statement. So, in other words, rebuttal time. The rebuttals for this first section are 10 minutes, and so it'll be a little bit shorter than the intros. And as I said, this is where we kind of get that interaction where the rubber meets the road. And I've got the timer set, so I'll go on your first word, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for the information, Jim. And I think Mr. Majors actually brings up a really good point. First, we have all these manuscripts. And there's several very early manuscripts that he referred to, especially with Sinaiticus. There's Vaticanus, which are dated early around the 1st century. There's P52, there's P66, P75. And what he's saying is correct. There's a number of early editions of texts that we have available to that don't have this reading like women and adults. Interesting point. Now, the first thing we have to understand when we're examining passages like this is, first, what do we know? Now, we know where the churches were located. We know how they were organized. In many cases, we know who the bishops were that provided oversight of these churches. We know how they communicated with each other. I think at the very start of the 1st century, even for those that maybe don't hold to the Gospels, they at least recognize that 7 letters of Paul are from Paul, which actually establishes this communication framework with the churches and sending out letters to each other so they can talk about things. Given that, we do have to deal with these variants, because if such variants, were interpolated into Scripture, they do actually mean something. So this whole idea that, if they added in the woman in adultery, if they added in the last 12 verses of Mark, it also begs the question, what else did they add? And when we get into these type of questions, it really opens up the possibility that if what Mr. Majors is saying is true, then how can we even say our documents are reliable? So the first thing we got to look at when we identify manuscripts such as Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, P66, P75, documents that we have that contain John that do not have these verses. is we first have to understand what are the provenance of these documents, which are very important. Um, and here's the difference, because when we don't know the origins or history of these documents, then what are they a witness of? And it's a very important question, because if the question is, do these texts represent the texts used in the apostolic churches? Well, obviously we have a problem. But do they, in fact, witness to the readings in the official churches? So we're talking about Rome, we're talking about Antioch, we're talking about Alexandria, actual historical churches that existed. We know the bishops of these churches. We know who's providing oversight. And as Mr. Majors already pointed out, there was many theological fights between a number of these groups. So it really shows that in a lot of ways, the churches were fighting. So the question then remains is, if this passage was interpolated, first, how did they do it? How did they get it into the majority of Greek, Latin, and in some Aramaic texts? So this is one of the problems for these interpolation theories, because when we talk about the woman in adultery, it's found in over 1,400, being as they made later manuscripts, they are in the majority of extant manuscripts that we have access to. Secondly, on top of that, there's about 200, and I believe 36 manuscripts that are without it. Now, the beauty of witnesses, especially those from the churches, is they can provide independent verification of the scriptures that were read at their congregations at a specific location, which gives us provenance. Now, one of the biggest texts is Jerome's revision in the 4th century. And the beauty about Jerome's, as opposed to when we look at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are two Greek texts, whose origins and history we do not know. The provenance of these texts are unknown. We don't know which text they belong to, but we know they are as early as 4th century, P75, P66. They're dated around the 2nd century as well. But the question is, do they witness to the original scriptures? Now, we know from Jerome's Vulgate that, first thing, we know what his methodology was. Jerome told us that the basis for his revision was to restore the Gospels to the original form of the Greek, and that he actually provides in his preface to the Gospels. In his letter to Marcella, he restates the same thing, and in his letter to Marcella, he's actually letting Marcella know that I'm not trying to alter the text of Scripture at all. What I'm doing is I'm restoring it to the original form. I'm not trying to alter or change anything. All I'm doing is trying to restore it. So we know Jerome's methodology. Now, Jerome actually speaks on the woman in adultery. In his letters, he states that the passage of the woman accused of adultery was actually found in many Greek and Latin manuscripts. Now, we know that Jerome used early Greek manuscripts as the basis. He was only trying to restore the passage to the original form of the Greek for the Latin Vulgate. He wasn't trying to change or alter anything. But one witness is not enough. I mean, obviously, on the basis of one witness, that testimony is not going to be changed. Now, what we do have to also consider is that the churches were well aware of corruptions to the text very early on. Marcion's edition in the 2nd century removed a number of passages from the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul. And in particularly the woman in adultery, we actually have testimony from Nikon, who was 10th century Greek, who actually accused the Armenians of actually casting out the account, which teaches us how the adulteress was taken to Jesus, saying that it was harmful for most persons to listen to such things. So we do have a very late example that explains that Nikon was accusing the Armenians of ripping it out of their texts. And Augustine in the 4th century, and this is coming from North Africa, Carthage, Those churches go all the way back. We understand the bishops that oversaw those churches. Not only does Augustine quote that passage, but he also explains that there was certain persons of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be giving impunity and sinning, removed from their manuscript the Lord's act of forgiveness towards the adulterers, as if he had said, sin no more, had granted permission to sin. So Augustine actually tells us in the 4th century of manuscripts that it was being actually taken out of. We have Didymus in Alexandria, who was the head of the catechetical school, teaching new catechumens Christianity, that Bart Ehrman even recognized as a witness to the woman in adultery. So Alexandria, North Africa, Rome with Jerome are witnesses to this passage. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, quotes this passage and also explains the problems that many in his congregations had. But what you don't have from Jerome, from Ambrose, from Augustine, from Didymus, is you don't have anyone that was saying it was added to the text. A thing we got to keep in consideration is that Jerome's Vulgate sparked outrage. His translation of Jonah that was read in a North Africa congregation, the changing of one word from gourd to ivory set out an outcry.
1 minute left.
So what we're saying is we have independent attestation from bishops who are both witnesses and guardians of the text. Not one bishop in the 4th or 5th century said this passage was added. And even Augustine, who actually reviewed Jerome's Vulgate against the Greek manuscripts, found nothing to object to after he had compared it against the Greek manuscripts he had access to. So when we consider the weight of the testimony, we don't have one ancient bishop saying it was added. All we have is these ancient documents of unknown provenance, which is just a witness of what? What testimony do they not provide? But when we go to the official churches, we see that their reading is official.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Right on time. So, very glad to be in this rebuttal phase. As I said, this is where the rubber meets the road. It's exciting, and so I'm sure this next rebuttal will also be exciting from Jim. So I'm setting the clock, Jim, and this is on your first word. I'll let it rip.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we still go back to Papias in the end. In the end, we still go back to Papias. We know that Irenaeus lists the Gospels, yes, but he's using a list by Hegesippus, and Hegesippus does not say that he received this list himself, but that he made the list himself. It does not. This is nothing that he inherited. So this apostolic succession of the church idea is something that I just can't wrap my head around, or this legal chain of custody. And Eusebius didn't even writes that there is nothing to know about Papias. That even in Eusebius's time, that nobody knew anything about the life of Papias outside of these obscure writings, and that is absolutely it. And Eusebius is not that credible. I believe Eusebius was the one who perpetuated this letter supposedly from Jesus that was sent to a king that a king summoned Jesus and was looking for a healer. And one of the apostles wound up there. I believe it was Timothy. I may be wrong. Maybe Peter. I don't know. But anyways, one of the apostles show up there, and he says, "Are you the apostle who was sent to heal me?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's me." And he passed that around. So for a while there, he was having people believe that Jesus actually wrote a letter, which we all know that, of course, Jesus didn't write anything. Now, whether they're not in their original in text, he said that there were two theories. One is that they were not by the eyewitnesses. And that is something that I would really like explained, is who are the eyewitnesses and how do we know that these are the eyewitnesses? First of all, Papias is the only piece of evidence that we have in order to date the Gospels where they are. But his writings about Mark and Matthew are not just secondhand, but they're third or fourth hand, removed from where we're getting these writings. We're not getting the writings straight from Papias. We're getting them from Irenaeus, and in some cases, we're getting them from Eusebius, from Irenaeus, from Papias. But like I said, we have events like the prayer in Gethsemane, where Jesus went to go pray alone, but yet somehow somebody heard every word that he said and was able to record it. Or when Jesus was up on the cross with the penitent thief and was telling him that, surely I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. Who was there with him to record that? Everybody was scared. Everybody was being rounded up. Even the women, who were usually the ones not in danger of anything. It says in Matthew that they stood far away and observed it from far away. The three Marys did. So you really have to, and there are so many other inconsistencies. For instance, the whole tomb story. Who was with Jesus at the tomb, and how do we know who was with Jesus at the tomb? We don't, because there are so many different stories. What happened to Jesus on the cross? Was Jesus quiet? What were his last words? What happened after he died? What happened during the trial? During the trial, when Jesus is brought before the high priest, or Caiaphas, or Pontius Pilate, or all three, depending on which gospel you read. Did I just sound like Bart Ehrman? But it's true. Depending on which gospel you read, depends on which story you get. You cannot take any story in its own context and get any accurate portrayal of who Jesus is. If you take Mark, we don't have a birth narrative. We don't have an original ending with a resurrection narrative. It ends at chapter 16, verse 8, and that's it. It says that the women were afraid. That's it. There's a 12th century manuscript, minuscule 304, that ends at verse 8. It's a really, really important one. If you have time, check that one out. I don't want to waste a whole lot of time on that one, though. But I could take a reductionist approach to this and say that because that the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, which are our earliest complete existing manuscripts, nearly complete, don't contain the long ending, then it's likely that the original text also ended at verse 8. But there are texts quoting the long ending that occur before the two codices were even written. And I'm sure that Jonathan's more than happy to agree with me there. But in order to read this account, we have to read it in its own independent literary works. The earliest evidence of the long ending we have is from Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, where he says that the resurrection is not dependent on the long ending. People at the time had an idea of I don't have that quote, I'm sorry. But the resurrection is not dependent on the long ending. People at the time had an idea of the story of the resurrection, and it shows based on the groupings of the original appearances of the text. And Bart Ehrman does outline that in his book, based on the different traditions that were floating around at the time. Let's see. I guess we can go with the okay, yeah. So in Mark, Jesus doesn't want anybody to know that he is the Messiah. In fact, in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus doesn't want anybody to know that he is the Messiah. And in some, it doesn't even acknowledge to us that he knows. The author knows, because they're writing this with prior knowledge. But only in John does Jesus outright and boldly proclaim his divinity. What's my time, James?
You got 3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay, good deal. Let's see. Okay, and in Matthew, for instance, Matthew, they have a whole lot about. Matthew's a lot more organized. Matthew has a whole lot about church rules, and I am a Markan. I do believe that Mark was the source of most of Mark and Matthew. Or, I'm sorry, of Matthew and Luke, and we can see that based on the similarities between it. Mark is very simplified, very rough, and then Matthew comes along and he refines it. He splits it up into different sections. He adds a birth narrative. He adds a resurrection story. He makes it very, very elegant and very appealing. And we can see these changes, and we can see the linguistic changes. In fact, with the story of the adulteress put into John, we can tell that it was originally either in Luke or it was originally from the source that Luke wrote from a Lucan source, because of these things that it has in it. For instance, the word that it uses for dawn is a word that is not used anywhere else in John, but it's used in Luke. And there are several other examples like this. There are clear interpolations and there are clear edits that are done by people with an agenda, by people with presuppositions, by people who are trying to advance their own agenda. For instance, Papias was happy to accept something as being from the Apostle John that said that Jesus would have a 1,000-year reign on earth. But it wasn't from John the Apostle, it was from John the Elder. But he was more than happy, or Irenaeus was more than happy to accept it as scripture, because he got it from Papias and because he supported the same ideology that he did in regards to Jesus' second coming. And with that, I conclude my time.
You bet. Well, thank you very much, Jim. And so now we'll move into the final rebuttal before the cross exam. So, very excited that this has been excellent, and I will start the clock. And this, everybody, is going to be just an 8-minute rebuttal, so these will be even quicker. So, on your first word, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there was a few things that Mr. Majors brought up that I would like to talk about. First, the gospel testimony is not dependent on one witness. Papias is just one independent source. But as I said, we have Irenaeus, who was from Asia Minor. We know who his bishop was. We got confirmation from Tertullian, Eusebius, and Irenaeus himself that Polycarp was placed there by the apostles. Tertullian in North Africa names the same 4 gospels by the same author as Irenaeus does on the opposite side of the Roman Empire. So how do we explain that all these independent centers of Christianity come up with the same 4 gospels, naming the same author for documents that don't have their names on it, unless it does go back to the apostles? Now, when we look at the Gnostic texts of Marcion, the Valentians, the Basilides, the Ebionites, all their texts were different. If we look at Nag Hammadi, there's over 50 different claims for apostolic texts, but when we compare it against the standard, we see all their texts were different. So how did thousands of churches that were fighting with each other, theological positions, they were fighting over texts? And I think Mr. Majors even brought up, Eusebius' disdain of Revelation. And Pope Boniface did reject in the late 5th century Revelation. But the churches in North Africa responded back saying, these are the texts that have been received in our churches to be read in church. And that was published at the Council of Carthage. So we don't have one witness, but thousands of independent witnesses. In the 2nd century, Eusebius tells us of Polycarp and the Church of Rome fighting over the date of Easter on when it should be observed. But the Church of Rome, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Alexandria, the Aramaic churches in Edessa, the churches in the West, all come up with the same 4 gospels, and they name the same 4 authors. So, the thing is, any one text can be changed, but the problem is, how do you get them into physical churches, and how do you get all these churches to agree, except if it does go back to the apostles? I know Jim brought up about mark and priority, but the first time that theory was first introduced was by Christopher Goblet in the late 18th century. What empirical documentation from the ancient world said that Mark was the first gospel? It wasn't from Irenaeus. It wasn't from Tertullian. It wasn't from Chrysostom at Antioch. It wasn't from Augustine in North Africa. There's not one ancient documentation from any of the churches that accept Mark as the first. So why should we reject our actual documentation from Irenaeus, from Pius, from Eusebius, from the thousands of independent churches? The Aramaic churches and the Greek churches fight over how Matthew was written, but they both say Matthew was first. So this idea that we're dependent on Pius is not the case. We have many different churches all across the Roman Empire coming up with the same testimony. Where independent witnesses agree, that would be conclusive. That for documents that don't have their name on it, and the polity of these churches are well documented. Eusebius records his succession list going back. Irenaeus says all churches can do this, and he actually lists the churches of Rome. And Tertullian, in his prescription against heretics, identifies the same polity. And even to this day, we can go to the official churches of Alexandria, the Church of Antioch, which actually moved out of Syria now. I think they're in Turkey. But they still all have these lists, and they're still basically all using the same text. Any one text can be changed. Readings can be added, they could be taken away, but it's another thing to add these texts throughout different independent churches that were fighting with each other over a number of things. And what the Aramaic churches show is that you weren't able to force any of these churches to accept anything. So while they are a witness to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, many of the Aramaic texts don't have Revelation, 2nd and 3rd John, 2nd Peter, and Jude. So there was no central authority to force. So how else do we explain that all these independent churches who have lists that can trace all the way back to the apostles come up with the same four gospels, naming the same authors, if it doesn't go back to them? What happens is we have to create all these myths to explain, well, we had unknown authors, but who were these authors? So we don't know who any of these people were. We don't know how they got them into the churches. How did they get them all to agree that all these things happened? So if we reject what the apostolic churches said, we are in a position where we have to start creating a number of speculative ideas or postmodern narratives to explain this.
2-minute warning.
I mean, so just to wrap up, the question is, why do we reject our documentation that is not just on Papias or Tertullian or Irenaeus or Eusebius or Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Athanasius, Augustine, Jerome, all over the geographic landscape in different languages by churches that didn't agree with each other, came up with the same testimony, if it doesn't go back. And there I will conclude my time.
You bet it. Excellent from both sides. I'm going to go into the final rebuttal. So this is going to be from Jim Majors. This is going to be 8 minutes, or basically it's, as you've noticed, the debaters can end whenever they feel satisfied. So with that, Jim, I will start the clock on your first word.
Well, I'd just like to point out first that Matthew, when mentioned by Papias, he says that it was written in the Hebrew, in a Hebrew manner. So he's saying that it was either written in Hebrew or maybe possibly in Aramaic. And you bring up the Council of Carthage, which took place in the the late 4th century, almost the year 400, 397, 398, and the that's about the same time that we have the first mention of many of these texts, especially around the world. Usually the earliest ones that we find are 4th century. That's usually when these things started getting widespread, and we really see a solidification of these gospels. And that makes sense that at the first council, when you have these representatives of the church to gather and decide on these important issues, which obviously they were important because it was necessary enough for them to call a council, one that hadn't been necessary, in order to hash these things out. And was partially because of Marcion, because of him challenging them by taking the book of Luke and taking all of the Judaic references out of it, and a few other things in order to more appease himself and how he viewed things. So I mean, that makes a lot of sense that these churches would be unified after they go and they agree on these things, whether they're fighting or not. But what is not important is not whether how far back we can trace these. If we can say that all of these churches have these same gospels, or that they all have roughly the same contents, whether they're missing a couple of little passages or not, or textual variants. But what's important is, are these people eyewitnesses? Who wrote these, and how do we know that? They are not autographs. In no way do they refer to themselves, other in Luke. It mentions Luke, the doctor, but there are no more medical references in Luke than you would find in any other normal document from that time, especially a Greek biology, a bios. And let's see. And as far as the listing goes, nobody says that Mark is first. I do find it curious, however, that when Papias is describing the accounts, and he's describing how John Mark writes Mark, and that Luke, a companion of Peter, wrote Luke. He actually lists Mark first in that list. So I find that really interesting. But look, let's not reject the documentation for its for those small variants. Let's not reject it for a 100 plus years gap in between these accounts, and let's not reject a very small amount of external witnesses that can actually say that they know who wrote these accounts. And even the ones who we do have, they are unreliable. For instance, Papias, the reference to John the Elder has led to much confusion, especially within the early church. And you have authors like, for instance, Tertullian. Tertullian doesn't mention the story of the adulteress or the long ending of Mark. He does not mention these things by name. He does not refer to these things. But let's, external evidence aside, let's go internal and ask ourselves, did these things happen? Did Jesus walk on water? Did Jesus calm the storm? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Where did he rise from? Who did he rise to? Did he come back in a bodily form, or did he come back in spirit? There are so many questions that are unanswered, and if these are truly eyewitness accounts and they wanted to accurately portray these things of Jesus, then they would be more accurate. For instance, Mark constantly refers to him as a teacher, calls him rabbi, yet Mark does not have many of the teachings found in the rest of the Gospels. And with John Mark being such a close follower, why would he not write these things, especially if he was so concerned with the teachings of Jesus? There are so many empty holes that are left in these things. Jesus, for instance, Jesus clarified some things, some antitheses. about the Old Testament, and said that that the Old Testament says do not murder, but I tell you, don't just not murder, but don't even be angry with your brothers and sisters. So he is changing the Old Testament law, something that the Old Testament is very, very much against. You shall not add or take away from the old law. So this is something that was very, very controversial, which is why whenever Jesus died, they even had a harder time convincing Jews to convert to Christianity. And the people who were believing in Christianity, they didn't believe they were starting a new religion. They believed that they were just continuing Judaism. And they were convinced of this by people interpolating and adding on to these accounts, these original accounts that copy from each other. We can see that there is visual, grammatical, textual evidence of this happening. And they suit their needs in order to spread this message. They fulfill messianic prophecies. They quote Isaiah 7:14 from the Septuagint, not knowing that the Septuagint wrongly translated it from the Old Testament. So the virgin birth isn't even necessary. And it is just such a, whenever you would look at it from that point of view and you see how much they struggle to make Jesus fit the Judaic prophecy, you can almost put yourself in the shoe of a first century Jew or a second century Jew or a third century Jew or even a third century Gentile. And these people trying to convince you that this Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament. How much time do I have left?
You got 50 seconds.
Oh, okay. That ain't my time.
You got it. Well, excellent, and I appreciate both introductions and rebuttals. And now things warm up. So very excited for this. Is always, I always say it every time, and it's always true every time. Cross-examination is always fun. Really, that kind of engagement that most people I think have expressed that they like that especially. So I am going to start the clock, and given that John is the affirmative and he's been leading, we'll have him start with his first 8 minutes, questioning, interrogating Jim, and then we'll flip where Jim will interrogate or question Jonathan for 8 minutes.
So I got a question. So I'm going to ask him a question and he's going to respond back during my 8 minutes, or?
That's right. So
okay.
Exactly.
You get to grill me for 8 minutes straight.
Oh.
Actually, 7 minutes and 45. 44.
Okay.
All right, I'll start on your first word. Ready? Floor is yours.
Okay, Mr. Major. So let's say, for argument's sake, you're correct that it wasn't written by eyewitnesses. It was actually written by other people. The question is, we're living in well-documented times. We have a good understanding of the documentation that was published. So who wrote it? Where was the epicenter? Who created all these churches? How did it get distributed to the churches to get it into the Greek, the Latin, the Aramaic, and the Coptic?
Which one do you want me to answer first?
Well, let's start with the beginning. So if it wasn't the authors, who created these documents?
I have no idea. I have no idea who created them, and I feel like the attributions to them are made on vague assumptions based on somebody who was not a very reliable source, meaning Papias.
Now, but we do have more sources other than Papias. So Irenaeus' testimony from Asia Minor and Gaul, Tertullian.
Irenaeus' testimony is quoting Papias.
Does he say that? Because he says that this is what has come down from the apostles, and this testimony is guarded by the succession of elders in the churches. So he doesn't say anywhere in Against Heresies that he's quoting Papias.
No, but that's where he gets that idea. That is where he gets his idea of who wrote these Gospels is from Papias, and there's no other source that Irenaeus gets this information from.
Well, but he did study at the feet of Polycarp.
No, he didn't study at the feet of him. He was a small child and he heard him speak.
Okay, but he is a witness to the churches of Asia Minor.
Yes.
Okay, and his bishop, and he does go into a very elaborate testimony of what he got. So he has a source that was connected to John. Is that correct?
Which John?
Well, now Eusebius
Oh,
documents John as
I'm
the
sorry.
apostle.
I'm sorry. This isn't your question time. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be asking
Oh,
you questions.
oh no,
Will,
it's okay.
will you be more specific? Which
Well,
John?
Tertullian says the apostle John appointed Polycarp over the churches of Asia Minor.
Right. So is that who you believe that Papias gets this source from?
Well, not paper. This is well, Tertullian in North Africa. Where did he get his source? Because Tertullian is coming up with the same information, listing the 4 documents that are witnessed by the churches that he's familiar with in North Africa, basically at the same time that Irenaeus is writing Book 3 against heresies.
Right.
But if you
And when is he writing this?
around 190 AD,
Okay.
so but the churches do go back. I mean, would you deny that the Church of Rome, churches in Asia Minor don't go back to the 1st century? I mean, Paul is writing at least 7 letters to, are they imaginary churches or actual churches?
No, I believe that he was listing actual churches, but I don't believe that Tertullian has been to any of those churches. I don't believe that Tertullian has any firsthand knowledge of those churches. I believe that he's just quoting Paul.
But from his writings, where do you get that he doesn't have innate knowledge of the churches? Because he describes the bishops that were appointed to Rome in his prescription against heresies. He
According
understands.
to tradition, because
Oh,
this list that he gets is from Hegesippus, and Hegesippus says that he makes this list, not that he receives it, and so we're still missing out on several lines of succession here.
well, now all these churches still have these lists. So where are all these?
Okay,
I mean,
but can we confirm any of that? For instance, who founded the church in Ireland? Was that Timothy?
I would have to check my sources, but
I don't remember. But so what records do we have? If these apostles founded these churches, wouldn't these churches take it upon themselves to actually not just make a list, but actually document the lives of their founders? We have no idea of who most of these apostles are.
Well, Eusebius' church history goes into where the apostles went, the churches that we set up, and in history we have these churches. The Church of Alexandria, which Clement of Alexandria, Papias, Eusebius, they all confirmed he went and set up the churches in Alexandria. Now, consequently, we do have churches in Alexandria. And the churches in Alexandria witnessed to those same 4 books, and they identified Mark as the author. So if it wasn't the apostles or it wasn't Mark, who set up all these churches, and how did they come up with these lists? I mean, Eusebius documents the major lists for all these churches. Where did all this stuff come from
But
if it wasn't the apostles?
all of these churches, with the exception of Antioch and Rome that you're listing, all of their lists, none of these are even started until the 2nd to 4th century. This is the earliest records that we have of these things, especially when it comes to manuscripts. We don't have manuscripts from any of these other places from the 2nd to 4th, before the 2nd century. So you're still at least 100 years removed from the authors of the originals.
Go to
So
2-minute warning.
Oh, okay. But we have independent witnesses. So we have the Aramaic churches, we have the Greek churches throughout the Mediterranean, the Western churches. So we're talking about in Spain, in Rome, in Milan, in Pontus. We have all these churches, but they're coming up with the same testimony. And that's what, so we have churches that don't agree with each other. And as you pointed out, Rome did dispute Revelation, but that doesn't invalidate the text that was received by all these other churches. So there were disagreement over text, but they all identified these same 4 gospels. And what I'm saying is, what is the mechanism? Even though you say that, these are like 100 years after the fact, Christian Staub and the 2-source hypothesis theory, this doesn't come up until the late 18th, 19th century. So who would be better attestations? Those that are representatives for the church, or the German rationalism of the late 18th and 19th century?
Well, I wouldn't say that either one of them are very reliable, but being as they both have an agenda.
How much more time do we got?
40 seconds.
40 seconds. Well, but independent witnesses agree, and this is common in any court of law, their testimony would be conclusive. So if they didn't collude, and we can't show any documentation where all the churches got together in the first, second, third, or fourth century to decide the text, how did they come up with the same testimony? I mean, this is testimony coming out of two major sees in the 2nd century out of North Africa and Asia Minor and Gaul.
But these churches did not come up with the same writings at the same time any more than the Gospels came up with their same idea of who Jesus was. I mean, you know, they all have the same thing. They all pass around the same information. We can say that about the Gospels. We can show the track record of the Gospels of who wrote what and who got it from whom. So I mean, we still don't have a line of succession to. If we have a line of succession, it is to one apostle. But then, which one is it?
We got time. So that was our first section of cross-exam, and now the tables will turn. So I will reset the clock, and this will be again on the first word, except the first word of Jim.
Okay, I guess the first question I would ask you is, was Matthew written in Hebrew or Aramaic?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because from the information we received from Irenaeus says it was written in the language of the Hebrews. Now, obviously, that could have been Aramaic, that could have been Greek as well, since both languages were spoken. Now, the thing is, we have a copy of Matthew in Aramaic. So we have Aramaic texts of Matthew. It's all documented, especially in the Peshitta.
Yes, we do. But we know that our text was not translated from that. Rather, it was translated from us, being as the Syrian texts are so late.
Yeah, and we also have, a copy of Matthew in Greek. We have it in Latin. We have it in Coptic. So whether
it's all later than Alexandrian text.
Well, and now Latin comes from, the Church of Rome received texts, and either it was written in Greek or Latin at the time. North Africa.
Right. It depends on when it was received. If it was received in the 1st century, it was Greek. If it was received in the 6th century, it was Latin, probably.
But as far as which came first, Jerome kind of thinks it was done in Aramaic. Irenaeus says the copy was done. Now, it could have been sent out in multiple copies. Now, that information we don't have. We know what has come down through the churches, and the churches that do come, they both have a copy of Matthew. But what they do both come up with is that Matthew was first. There's no ancient church or writer that says anything different, that Matthew wasn't first.
The majority of the biblical scholars would tell you that Mark is first.
That's correct. Now, starting in 1785 with Christopher Goblet, that's the first time that idea was invented. So,
because prior to 75, textual criticism of the Bible really wasn't a thing.
Jerome did textual criticism. We have
he did textual criticism of the Old Testament only for the purpose of not the Old Testament, but he only did textual criticism for the purpose of the Vulgate.
Well, but he did the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have Euphilus. We have Lucan, who did his edition of the Old Testament. We have a number of scholars in the 15th century. I mean, Erasmus, Cardinal Jimenez. We have Stephanus, we have William Tyndale, we have Luther, who did his version. So textual criticism was always biblical scholarship was always a part of it. Now, Athanasius, lists, who was the bishop of Alexandria, lists Matthew, first. Jerome, who's worked on his edition of the Vulgate, lists Matthew first. Now, so they are the closest to these churches. and they all come up with Matthew first. It's not until 1785 that Christopher Stalbert first comes up with this idea. But the question is, what documentation or empirical data from the ancient world does he base that theory on?
The text himself.
No, but what document? Who said Matthew was first? Because we're talking about an order of publication.
We can't.
Looking at text.
We can't. I hate to interrupt. We can't have too many questions asked,
my bad.
the opposite direction.
To answer that question, who wrote that Jesus rose from the dead? What external source do we have that verifies that? I mean, that's a silly question, saying that we have to reject something because we're basing it solely on internal evidence, when the entire idea of Jesus is based on internal evidence.
4-minute warning.
Can you say that one more time, Mark?
Oh,
no.
I was saying that how can you reject that whenever it fuck, I don't remember what I said. What were we talking about?
So I think I was questioning it, because it started with modern scholarship view, and you're correct. The modern worldview is Mark is first, but we can trace that idea back to 1785 with Christopher Goblet, and then we.
Right. But just because that idea did not exist before does not, we can't reject that. For instance, for the majority of humans' existence, we thought that that we were in a geocentric dome. So I mean, that changing a person's idea or changing a person's scholarship of an idea, we shouldn't reject it just based on popular consensus, which is exactly how these gospels were formed, and why these things were accepted into canon was by popular acceptance. They didn't care that they were by the apostles. They didn't care that it was John Mark. They didn't care that it was an interpreter of Peter. They cared that it backed up their exegesis.
But they rejected. Tertullian makes a very good point of a presbyter in Asia Minor trying to falsify a passage under the name of Paul. Not only was he removed, so it does show that they cared. Jerome's translation Vulgate showed that the change of one word, the congregation denounced as false. Marcion's attempt to redact major passages from Luke and 10 letters of Paul were challenged.
Of course they were, because they challenged their exegesis. They challenged their idea of who Jesus was. They removed all of these Judaic ideas. He wanted to completely do away with it. In fact, Paul, even between Paul and the apostles, there was a huge argument. At one of these councils, there's a huge argument over whether or not uncircumcised Gentiles could become Christian, or not even that, but whether Jewish Christians could even eat with uncircumcised Gentiles. So I mean, yes, there was division in the early church. There was diversity in the early church, but there was always a majority consensus of every idea, and that majority consensus is what won out in the end.
1 minute.
How much time we've got, James?
1 minute left.
I guess my last question. Wait, is it my question or?
Yeah, it's your question.
Okay. I guess my last question to you would be to explain the need that Matthew and Luke felt to refer to a prophecy in Isaiah that was for King Ahaz, and not even for Jesus.
Say that one more time.
Why did Matthew and Luke feel the need to insert the virgin birth narrative based on Isaiah 7:14? Why search for these what they thought were messianic prophecies?
Well,
if Jesus was already the real deal.
Well, what we see in the Gospels is their reporting, and I think one thing that's key when we look at why Luke did one way, why Mark did another, and why Matthew wrote it this way and John another is, and I think Chrysostom points out this point, is that when we have four that write, not at the same time, not the same place, neither having met together, which showing they didn't come together to conclude, and they speak all things as it's almost as one mouth, it becomes a very great demonstration of the truth. And where we see these differences between them, or why does Matthew report this and Luke reports it differently? Obviously, if they all came together to conclude and falsify events, that would be indication of collusion. But because there are these differences, and we see this in witness testimony all the time in normal courts of law, where they're reporting on it from their vantage point. But what we do see in all four accounts is the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of, of a Messiah, of a person. So that we do see.
Okay, but where did they get the virgin birth?
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Oh, okay.
Like, I hate to cut you guys off. I let John keep going to try to let him finish his answer, but
Sure.
Basically, now we will go into the closings, and then, by the way, definitely we have a good list of questions. Some for Jonathan, and then a good number for Jim. So,
that's good.
In the audience, if you want to keep firing questions for Jim as well, in addition to the ones for Jonathan, we want both. So it's good that we do have the ones for Jonathan, but just making sure that we can ideally alternate so each person gets a question every other. So with that, we will go to the closing statements. So these will be short and sweet. This is just 5 minutes, and that's set on the clock, and I will go on the first word for Jonathan.
Okay, well, thank you again for your questions, Mr. Major. I think for me, one of the, when I look at the evidence, it's first I have to explain that we know that there was all these churches throughout the Mediterranean. They were in North Africa. They're in Edessa. I mean, we have churches all over the organization. Now, there was many claims for apostolic writings, and we see this at Nag Hammadi. We see over 50 different texts that were published claiming they were from the apostles, that they have testimony from Jesus. And what we see, though, is with the churches themselves, they have a very unique systematic formation where they provided oversight of the churches through the succession of bishops that were there to secure the transfer and control and text that was handed down. And when we look at that objective framework, whether it's in North Africa, whether it's in Alexandria, whether it's in Antioch, whether it's in Rome, whether it's in Asia Minor, we look at the four Gospels, they come up with the same testimony for churches that Mr. Majors was able to document that don't agree with each other. There was big theological fights. There were fights over Revelation. There was disputes on Hebrews. We know that there were a lot of different fights textually over passages of Scripture. But what we see in all these churches that can source back to the apostles is they all come up with the same testimony of the four Gospels. There are witnesses of those same four books, and they name the same author. So when we look at Occam's razor, which basically says what best explains the Gospels, were they written by unknown authors? And how did these unknown authors get them all across the Mediterranean with no one even figuring out who they were? We obviously know the authors of many works from the first century, but one of the greatest publications in history itself is the Gospel testimony. Yet modern scholarship is saying that we don't know who wrote them. We don't know how they got into all the churches. We don't know how the churches all witnessed to these same texts when there was over 50 other textual documents out there that didn't get into the church. So what best explains this? that they were a result of unnamed people traveling around the ancient world and didn't get noticed by any of these churches, any of these bishops that held oversight? Or do they go back to the apostles as Irenaeus, as Eusebius, as Tertullian, and the rest of the apostolic churches said they did? So that's what we have to look at. What is the simplest explanation to account for the authorship and distribution of these gospels all across the ancient world? Is it these unknown authors, these people adding these passages? How do they come up with the same testimony if it doesn't go back to the original? And I'll end on my closing there.
You got it. So with that, we will now go to the final section for the closing statement from Jim Majors. And so, Jim, same deal. I will start the clock on your first word.
So I will go back to where I opened with presuppositions. It's easy to come up with the same testimony for all these gospels when they're copying from each other. It is easy to come up with the same testimony when you are building upon somebody else's statement. It is easier to discredit these things based on that knowledge, based on knowing that some 660 something out of 660 something verses of Mark, 600 of them or so are in both Matthew and Luke. There's very little of Mark that is exclusive to Mark because it has been copied so much. So if these eyewitnesses would not need to build upon each other's account, they would not have to rely on each other's words in order to make a cohesive timeline of the narrative of Jesus Christ. In fact, in Luke, in the very beginning of Luke, it says that it was written that he gets those writing these stories by those who were in the beginning were eyewitnesses. And even in Matthew, it says the story has been spread among Jews to this day. These are not people who are eyewitnesses that are recording these accounts. These are at best second, third, fourth, fifth hand writings that take place 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, sometimes possibly even 80 years after the death of Jesus. And they are not reliable. They're not reliable from externally because of the sources. Papias is unreliable. Eusebius has proven himself to be unreliable. Irenaeus has proven himself to be unreliable. Jerome has proven himself to be unreliable. He was involved with many scandals, and he had to move to Bethlehem. But you won't read that anywhere because they've kind of covered that up. But that's another fun read. But just to wrap everything up, what like Jonathan said, what best explains the authors? Were these eyewitnesses who could not depend on their own writings, because they could all write, according to Jonathan, did they all depend on their own writings and write their own accounts that just happened to be divinely guided to look exactly like the other person's accounts, even seeing the same grammatical and textual variants that are in the different accounts? Or is it more likely that there was a collection of stories and a collection of interpolations that were compounded upon each other in order to build this cohesive argument to support somebody's exegesis, in order to support somebody's religious ideas that they wanted to progress? And it's something that we see. People who didn't have the same ideas were excommunicated. People who did have the same ideas were praised. People who came to these epiphanic revelations about the text that later turned out to be heresy, at the time they were praised. It was not heresy at the time. And there's so much wrong with the gospel. It is just so hard for me to understand how anybody can think that it is reliable for anything other than comparing it to each other. We can determine which of the texts have the majority of the same thing. Yes, we can show where these texts went. We can show what area they were written in roughly, what time they were written in, but what we can't show is who wrote these. Where were they when these were written? I mean, where were these people there when these things happened? Is this something that they heard from a friend? Is it something that they heard from were they a follower of the disciple? Were they a follower of a follower of the disciple? Or were they a second temple church leader or a Christian church leader that were writing these things in order to progress their own agenda? It's something that we don't know, and that, I mean, we can only speculate on, but as of now, we can't say that they're reliable.
20 seconds.
And with that, I conclude my time.
You got it. All right. Thank you both debaters for your speeches in these different sections. This is really like very much like a live in-person debate that you'd see at a university. The intros are a little shorter, but like this is like pretty standard in terms of the kind of like, at least the William Lane Craig type debates. The standard is what I mean by that. So you guys have you guys have hit the books, and you guys have presented clearly. So it's exactly what we were hoping for, and it was cordial as well. So for the Q&A, very excited to read your guys' questions. And with that, we're going to, by the way, happy birthday to Klaus Schumacher. Very exciting. It's his birthday today, and he's spending it here to listen to you guys. So
happy birthday.
Yeah, that's awesome. So anyway, with that, we will go to the first question. And so, by the way, Brian Stevens, I want to say thank you so much for, I don't think I mentioned it yesterday. I was like so frazzled and not knowing how to respond. We got our first super chat donation from Brian Stevens. I want to say thank you so much. I didn't know what to do. Like hadn't thought through like how we'll handle super chat. In the event that it happens, I think what we'll do is we'll of course read questions that aren't super chats, and that's all the ones that I have now, and we'll do that just as we always do, letting people know your name and then reading it out loud. If you do a super chat and you want to give a comment to either Jim or Jonathan, so if you're like, well, hey, I want to actually point out to Jonathan that this is something in a historical record, I want to say, Jonathan, please be aware that this is the case, and thus let Jonathan give a quick response. That would be, I guess we'll say, a way in which we'd let you not just ask a question, because we've usually just said, like, can you put it in the form of a question? So with that, the first one is from James Downard. Glad to have you here, James, and he asks, question to both. So this is great. We'll start again with John, as we've always is. If it doesn't come up, in what year was Jesus born, according to the Gospels?
Yeah, I think when we look at that question, we have a time period. Obviously, AD wasn't created until I think around the 6th century with the monk that actually set up that time system. So they actually refer to at the time of Caesar Augustus. That gives us a general frame of time to work with as far as the birth of Christ.
Gotcha. And then Jim as well.
I don't think that it's really possible to know the birth of Jesus. When Luke's describing it to us, he tells us that that Jesus was born during the census of Quirinius. I mean, there is a small gap there in between the two birth accounts. But there have been some attempts to harmonize it that kind of place Jesus's birth at around 4 CE, which I can see some good arguments there, but I'm just gonna stick with 0.
You got it. Excellent. And the next question is from Pine Creek, and this is specifically for John. So Pine Creek says, assuming the Gospels are reliable, what is the most reliable claim and least reliable claim? And what method does John use to differentiate which is the most reliable or least reliable claim?
Well, I mean, obviously the most important would be the resurrection account. I would say that's probably the most reliable claim. Once again, where Christianity differs than other religion is, we have 4 independent testimonies conferring to that event. While there are some what people may review as differences between the gospel, in that account there is none. They witness to the same resurrection from their vantage point that we can get at. So as far as the least reliable, going back to the birth, we have a time frame. What could be most not reliable testimony? So what does not accord with the facts on that case? I mean, the birth narrative, there's obviously stuff that those who don't believe in the gospel will reject, from miracles to supernatural events. So I know where Pine Creek is going with this, but there's things that could be debated as far as from a historical standpoint. Did this person exist or did this not? But I would say the resurrection would be key. I think Pine Creek would probably say the zombies are the least reliable. But and it's also, in retrospect, what did they mean? Were there visions? What did they see at that time that allowed the author to convey that point? So,
you got it. And also, thank you both to Milwaukee Atheist and Ronald Mendonca for your guys' super chats. Totally appreciate the support. And as mentioned, we're taking like these donations, and we are working on getting a streaming computer or a gaming computer. As you've been patient with us, as we've sometimes had buffering, and we're kind of working on. We've got old laptops, but we're gonna get there. And so thank you for your financial support. And I'm gonna read the super chats just kind of as they come in, because I don't want to like just squeeze them in at the very end. So Milwaukee Atheist said he also has a question which we'll get to, but he said he wanted to tell Jim that he looks beautiful. So you got a fan. You got fans in the audience, Jim.
Thank you, darling.
Yeah, well, Jim Majors is a good-looking guy, so that's
oh, shucks, guys, y'all quit.
And so thank you for that. And then we have also Ronald. So thanks, Milwaukee Atheist, for your $5 donation, and thank you very much, Ronald Mendonca, for your $15 donation. Very generous. He asked Jonathan, can you think of a more efficient way for God to have delivered his message?
No, I think letters were very common, especially in the first century. So obviously, because we have a written publication that actually came down, that doesn't lead to speculation or what was said that we find in other religions. I think that was the most efficient way. And this is common in the ancient world, where they're writing letters to one another, and we have written accounts that were passed on to the churches. I mean, otherwise, when we get into other religions, you see oral traditions coming down. You have to speculate where it really came from.
You got it. And I also want to say, forgive me, Milwaukee Atheist. I know that you have a question, but I'm trying to just look for it so that I don't miss it. I am scrolling through, and I'm so sorry. I don't have it in the list, but I believe that you asked it, but I just want to let you know I'm really sorry. If you're able to quick resubmit the question, I'll definitely ask it to whichever speaker it's directed to. And sorry about that. Thanks for your patience. So the next question is, Pine Creek asks, question for John. No, we covered that one, thanks. This one's for Jim. So JMD Apologetics asks, if the manuscript evidence was good for the Gospels, would that convince you of the claims of them?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yep, it's JMD Apologetics asks, if the manuscript evidence was good for the Gospels, would that convince you of the claims of the Gospels?
Okay, so I think what they're asking is, if there was good evidence that the Gospels went back to the apostles, would I believe them? Or if there is that what they're asking pretty much?
I think so. Like, if you granted them as like historically reliable, if they met like your historical criteria, like your methods.
Right. Well, I mean, even if we can verify the source of who wrote these, even if we can find the originals, the actual autographs of these, we would still have to account for the obvious copying and the obvious interpolations, and we would have to suss out, I mean, the weeds from the wheat, so to speak, and try to figure out what is real and what is not. Like Jesus says, a good scribe goes in and he brings out all of the old and new scrolls.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much, both for the question and for the answer. James Downard asks, this is a question for Jonathan. What would historical evidence need to look like for you to regard a gospel account as unreliable?
I'm trying to think. A gospel account. Well, if there's testimony from the period, I mean, obviously, if the Acts of Pilate came out, we know they had written records. They were very much. I mean, they wrote during that time. So obviously, if there was testimony that were published by the Roman Empire, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, to refute what was actually said in the gospel testimony. I mean, Josephus was, there at Rome even later. He could have provided an account to contradict what the gospels had said. So, if there was an ancient, credible tome, rejecting what the gospels had said, I guess, he and Jim would be drinking more beers together. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to.
Oh, there's nothing to say that we can't have a beer together. I'm just saying.
Oh, touche. Yeah, we can always. Oh, that looks great too, by the way.
That does look good. so thank you very much for the question and the answer. And thanks for your patience, Milwaukee Atheist. We got your question. So Milwaukee Atheist, this is their question that, thanks for rewriting that as I missed it. So they asked, how does Jonathan resolve the contradiction between Luke's birth narrative and Matthew's? Matthew would have it be during 4 BCE or prior, and Luke sets it to 6 CE or later.
Oh, okay. You ready for me to answer?
Yep.
Well, I think first, when we look at, and once again, they're referring to time differences right there. So if they were actually colluding on the testimony, why didn't they get it exactly right? So I think when we see these differences, now they're referring to time frames. So to pinpoint an actual time frame, going back through the records, see how they square up, they're writing at basically the same time period. They place it within the margin of error there. And so, what they meant from that perspective, it's very hard to actually read what they were thinking when they wrote that. But what we don't see is if they were just trying to copy or collude an account, that they were trying to make everything match exactly. And once again, we see this with witnesses who are conveying testimony that 2 individual people were at, and even though they don't give exactly the same precise information, they're coming up with basically the same story. Obviously, it's different if they placed it after the time of Trajan. So they have a very similar time frame.
Can I ask just real quick, which of the apostles were at the birth of Jesus?
Which were none of the apostles were at the birth of Jesus, but they did have access to Mary, who was. So Peter did have access to Mary. Paul, who knew Peter, and we know his scribe Luke had access to Peter because he did meet him at Antioch. So we're talking about Peter, Paul, John, James, who are actual people that know each other. So the sources of their information is we have the family of Joseph and we have the family of Mary. So that's very good corroboration as far as the virgin birth. So from the standpoint, from historically, the family of Jesus, which is Mary and Joseph, and Peter John and them had access to those individuals. So from a historical standpoint, they had access to Mary to get the information, and the family of Joseph. Two
Right,
independent.
but if they got that information from Mary or Joseph, wouldn't it help credibility's sake to say that they got it from that? Because anyone else that is quoted that is of substance, it says so and so says. It does not say, it is said, it's directly quoting. So I mean, you're not seeing a quote here, but in Luke, however, Luke 1:1 in the very intro, it says that he gets these from eyewitness accounts. Yes, Matthew and Luke's birth narratives don't line up. The dates don't line up. So no, they didn't get everything from each other. They didn't get everything from Mark. Obviously, Mark has no birth narrative. But the fact is that they both got these things from a mistranslation in the Septuagint that led to a faulty belief in the need for a virgin birth.
I'll give John a response. And then I hate to do it. Forgive me.
I'm sorry.
It's an interesting.
No, it's okay.
I know you guys both have thoughts on it, so I'll let you quick respond, Jonathan, and then we'll just to keep trying to get through as many questions as possible.
Yeah, I think with the two genealogical accounts, obviously, Julius Africanus actually does discussion. Eusebius does provide his testimony, and actually shows that Matthew's getting it from one line, and Luke is getting it from another. But obviously, based on all these theories that arose in the late 18th century, they're not pulling from the same exact sources. They're not copying each other if they didn't want to square away these accounts. But so when we look at this, I mean, it's hard to read the mind to scribe. What were they thinking? But when we tie this up with documentation we have from the ancient world, it says, well, Matthew is giving the account through Joseph's line, and Luke is doing it through Mary. And we know Paul knew, obviously, Peter, who knew Mary. So we understand where the sources are coming from that standpoint.
Gotcha. So we will move to the next question, and thank you for that question, by the way, and both the responses. So we've got Bud Askins. His question is, Jesus says he came only as a Messiah for the house of Israel in Matthew. So why do people outside of this small group of Jews call him their Savior? This is admittedly a tough one for you, Jonathan. It's like Bud himself said, he's like, I'm not sure if this is like fully within the context, and so I threw you a hardball because I am confident in you, but it's admittedly not quite maybe within the scope of reliability. So you don't feel obligated to field it?
Well, say the question one more time.
Yep. So it says that Jesus says he came only as a Messiah for the house of Israel in Matthew. So why do people outside of this small group of Jews call him their Savior?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. I have to research more. But, the Jews were expecting an earthly, kingdom for a Messiah to come. I mean, especially when we look at the Bar Kokhba War,
especially when you look at the word Messiah, the Messiah was the anointed king. This was somebody who was supposed to help them throughout these difficult times and take back Jerusalem and finally rule over Israel again in an earthly form. That was the whole idea of it, which is why when Jesus died, there was a great need for people to explain why the supposed Jewish savior had died.
So, with that, is it you guys both feel satisfied, or if you want to add anything, you can?
I would like to add, just for clarification's sake, the last question when he was referring to Matthew being just for the people of Israel. It has a story in there about the Canaanite woman who is begging and pleading Jesus to help her, and she's on her hands and knees and grabbing at his robes and at his feet, just weeping. And Jesus just ignores her cries, and finally the disciples said, why don't you just send her away? And Jesus, he tells her, he said, we do not give the children's bread to the dogs. Meaning the children of Israel, we do not waste the blessings of Jesus on the Canaanites, on the people who are not the intended people to receive this. But he does later help her, but yeah.
You got it. So we will go. Thank you both for your responses to Bud, and with that we have Pine Creek. This is coming at you, John. It's a true or false. He wants a true or false. So he says the Gospels contain. So in other words, for John, true or false, the Gospels contain a first-person account of someone writing in their own hand. They saw a risen Jesus in bodily form.
Well, Luke used eyewitnesses, so Mark used sermons from Peter, so they're getting it from their sources. So obviously, John is, he was at the resurrection. So obviously, John, and in his gospel, it also talks about the scribes that are writing the gospel, because obviously they had scribes back then that could write what John is saying. But so true to the effect that they're using sources that are witnesses to the eyewitness accounts. I mean, Peter, Mark's being Peter's interpreter and scribe, and then we look at John, who was a witness, and then as well as Matthew as well. So,
how was John a witness?
Well, he was at the resurrection event. He laid on Mary's. He was at there with Mary.
So you think the Apostle John wrote the book of the Gospel of John?
Well, that's what Irenaeus says, that he wrote it while he was at Ephesus.
Well, I understand that, but in your own studies, is that what you believe?
Well, yeah, I have to go off of the empirical documentation. So.
No, you absolutely do not. Why in the world would you base any of your decisions on the word of one person, especially somebody so far removed from the event?
No, and that is a good question, Jim. But it's not on one person. Now, if it was on one person, you would be correct. If I had to rely on just one person or even two people, I don't think the testimony could stand. But you have all these individual churches that were set up that identified John as the author. I mean, sure. How else? So
that's tradition, though, and I mean, look at traditional church. Traditional, for instance, in Judaism, traditionally they believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books. They believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and we know that's not be true.
We've got. I'll give
sorry.
John a quick final response, and then we got to bring it back to questions because we're running out of time to make it through all the questions, and so.
Oh no, we could go right to questions if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, you got it. So, I know you had something, John. I hate cutting you off, but just to try to squeeze these in. By the way, this is the first time we've had a true or false question, so I'm like, I don't know how to handle that, to be honest. Because
tell Pine Creek, why doesn't he invite me on his show to talk about some of these things?
Ooh, that's feisty. All right, so let me know in the chat or in the comments after how to handle true or false questions, and also new topics. We'll talk about it at the end. But next question. James Downard asks, source. This is a source methods question for both speakers. How much of Celsius's criticism of Christians was quoted by Origen, and how accurate were his quotations from that source? Namely, Origen's quotations from that source.
Well, I've actually read Origen's response from Celsius. So, and this is, one of the great ancient philosophers of the day trying to refute Christianity, which shows the pagans were out there trying to report on it. Now, we only have the account that comes through Origen, and it's the same thing with Profer of Tyre. We know that he wrote volumes against Christianity, especially making fun of the long ending of Mark, teasing that the bishops should be given poison. So, I think we have a pretty reliable account from Origin, because who would start making fun of that stuff? It's the same thing with Pro for Attire. We don't actually have his volumes. We have secondhand accounts from the beginning of the 4th century, from the writings of Jerome and others that pass on the account. But who would make up the type of stuff that is being said by Pro for Attire and Celsius to mock Christianity in this way? I'll let Jim talk. Does that make sense?
No, yeah. That makes sense. And yeah, like I agree with Jonathan. You know, we really only have one side of that, and according to him, according to Origin, you know, he says that he was accusing Jesus of doing witchcraft and accusing Jesus of all these other crazy things. But I mean, we like Jonathan said, we really don't have any. We just have mentions of his works. Let's see, is it he wrote it under Marcus Aurelius or something like that. It was something a long time ago. But no, I don't really think that has any play on the validity of the Gospels one way or the other, though.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And if you guys both feel satisfied, so well, that's right. You guys, he asked for both of you to respond, so we're good. Thank you guys very much. And he, by the way, James Downard said that afterward. He said that was a trick question. So, but I'm gonna jump quick to Soul Watcher, and then we're close to out of time, but I think we can get these last three, and then I'm kind of closing the intake for the Q&A. I think pretty much everybody was done firing them in. So Soul Watcher 72 asks, what scrolls or writings that were excluded from the Bible would have given us a different narrative? That's for both if possible. If not, then to Jim Majors. Thanks. So I can reread that again if you'd like.
No. Well, you know, there's this idea that, the Gnostic texts are a perfect example. Were these books banned from the Bible? And I think, this is an important point for Christianity, is if there was this collusion where the churches all got together and they started, framing their narrative for their ideological purposes, a point that Jim Majors brings up. Marcion accused the church of framing their texts to support their ideological views. You have the so-called Gospel of Peter, which is a further revelation of, a resurrection of account of crosses working. You have the Gospel of Truth by the Valentinians, and you have 50 or so other texts that we still have in possession from Nag Hammadi that can be viewed as excluded. So I think this idea that Christians walk around and, I wouldn't say blindly accept the four Gospels, but they have to understand what Jim has said, is that there was other groups that did challenge a number of the apostolic churches on their texts, as they were excluding this stuff in an attempt to frame their fashion of the Christ. And I kind of leave it there.
You got it. So, and that's for both if possible. So, and it said if not, then to Jim Majors. So sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No, that's fine. Can you ask that one more time? I just want to make sure that I address the question itself and not just where I was going with that.
Yeah, it said, what scrolls or writings that were excluded from the Bible would have given us a different narrative?
Well, the only thing is that we don't know what we don't know, right? So, prior to what we know, we don't know. So we have a very large gap, and granted, the material used at the time, papyrus, made from these bamboo reed mats, that they were very fragile and they didn't last very long. Well, I say they didn't last very long. Some of them lasted up to 100 years, but people would usually use them until they had used their purpose, and then they would discard them. So usually when they were being discarded, which is what most of our manuscripts are discards, they were beyond the point of recognition. So we are lucky to have what what is called a wealth of or what was it, an abundance of riches, of textual riches, and these all these different manuscripts that we have. But I mean, we don't. There's no way to know what the original text is, so there's no way to know what was taken out.
Gotcha. You bet. Thank you very much for the question and for both of your guys' answers. So, next, James Downard asks, this is a source question. What sources and eyewitnesses are identified by Luke as his sources? And how accurate were his versions compared to the sources?
Well, he did say he had eyewitnesses. Now, he was a companion of Paul. We know that. Paul had access to Peter and John and James. So, but there's also other witnesses around there that he could have used as well. So, as far as definitively, we know who. Luke was a companion of Paul. So, Paul's sources would be who he had available to. That includes, Mary, since they knew Peter, so he obviously had access, just like any other investigator, who's providing testimony of this, would interview the witnesses. So what witnesses did he have available to him that he knew? He knew Paul, who knew Peter, who knew John and James. So he had the opportunity to have those witnesses that he was able to question.
Gotcha. And then there was a question for both. So Jim, if you want to answer as well, you're welcome to.
I don't believe that there is any credible mention of Luke writing Luke. It does briefly mention Luke as the physician in Colossians, but in the letter to Philemon, it just includes Luke. It doesn't say that he was a doctor or anything like that. And the funny thing is that the verse, forgive me what it is, but I don't remember what it is. It's in Colossians 4 that says that it's a pseudograph. It's a forgery. It was an interpolation by a scribe later on.
Next, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have R.G. Downard asks for Jonathan, who established the Mormon churches? Does your logic not mean that because they existed, the Book of Mormon is correct?
Well, that's a good question. So when we look at it with the Book of Mormon, you have the golden plates. It's sort of, when I look at that, first, we don't have any copy of the golden plates. It's sort of like the Q theory that tries to support the two-source hypothesis. Well, we have these churches, but we don't have any of them that had Q, and none of the Mormon churches have the golden plates either. So, so when they talk about this other testament, and this is why when we look at the apostolic churches, they have to trace back to an apostle, but then the testimony has to be Catholic, and it has to be universal attestation to the same books by the same group of churches that can trace back. Now, I don't know any church, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, North Africa, anyone in the West that have either the Q document, the golden plates, and none of the Mormon churches actually have a copy of those Mormon plates. So until we could get to the bottom of that, I don't see how they have any reliable textual history on there.
You got it. Well, thank you very much for everybody's questions and for the debaters' answers, getting in the hot seat, not just with each other in their different time sections, which, by the way, is impressive that they're willing and able to jump into, if you total it up, 12 minutes intro, 10-minute rebuttal, 8-minute second rebuttal, and then you add up the closing. That's a lot of time to fill with good content. And so I want to say thank you for the debaters. This just wouldn't exist without the debaters. We appreciate you guys putting in the reading time, some of it for this debate specifically, and some of it even before you had heard of this channel. So in sharing that information, we are very grateful for you guys sharing your ideas and for also a courteous debate. So again, thank you very much to the debaters.
Thank you, James.
No, thank you, James.
My pleasure. And a reminder to everybody, the speakers have their links down in the description. And hey, go check it out. And there's nothing that says, as Jim said, you can still have beers together. And so
Always.
And Jonathan would agree. There's nothing that says that you can't even make a new friend. So if you want to reach out to them, you can. They're both on Twitter as well. And so I will put their Twitter into the description just in case you want to shoot a tweet out to them as well. And then you can personally reach them there. So thank you so much for your questions of the audience. Absolutely terrific, deep questions. This is like high level, like technical, and it's awesome though. We had like such a huge crowd that was hanging in there listening to this high level stuff. And so it's like, this is just, I think, great for YouTube. And what else? We'd hopefully get to have these debaters back. And so hit that subscribe button if you would like to hopefully see them in the future and get a reminder of when we hopefully do get the opportunity if we get to have them come back. And last thing, really quick, just going to show you guys that we have next week is a provocative one. I'm kind of curious if the debaters want to share their thoughts on this. This is the debate we will have next week. Is internet atheism a hate cult? So this is a real debate. So this is going to be from Max Dean Esme of Red Pill Religion, as well as from our friend Skylar Fiction. And they're both going to be on debating that issue. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are. Do you think it could be fruitful? Because one thing we're already thinking, I'm like, maybe this one, the roof might blow off. So hopefully you'll be there, and this will be a very interesting. I've never had this topic. I've never seen this topic. So with that, debaters, what are your thoughts? Do you think this is possible without things exploding?
No, I think it's going to be a dumpster fire from the get-go.
Yeah, it really might. That does concern me as a possibility. So, Jonathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be all-out war, especially with Red Pill and Skylar. I'm interested to tune in to see how far it actually goes.
I have to say, I really admire Skylar's approach, even with people that frustrate him. He's very collected and concise in his answers, and I really have to give him props for the way that he addresses things.
I found him to be very gentle and personable, and that's something when I've talked to him. He's been on here before with Inspiring Philosophy, and I just thought, wow, this is clearly a very personable, kind guy, and so it's going to be very interesting. And then the date is technically tentative. We're figuring out the exact date. It's either Monday or Tuesday. We're very confident we can get it on one of those days. Sorry about that. So that was my fault in the emails. I screwed up. So hang in there with us. But again, I just want to say thank you to the debaters for making this a superb night. And thanks for coming on, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So with that, we will close out, and just want to let you all know, remind you, keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Have a great night, everybody.